Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leading in charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS, or the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of ADOS podcast, a weekly show where we bring you undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. You can find us every Friday, 10 a.m. on WCRS 92.7 and 98.3 here in Columbus, Ohio, or you can listen on your favorite podcast app. This is episode 26. I am your host, Lisa Todd, along with my co-host,
Daud Giazon. On today's show, we will share articles from The Intercept, Democracy Now!, Market Watch, Axios.com, Kentucky State AFL-CIO, and KPIX. Later in the show, stay tuned for our main event, where we dive into and interview the article, How White and Non-Black People Can Pay Reparations, Even If Congress Never Figures It Out.
Personality.
Peace. This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose a question that forces us to have personalities.
Okay, what questions do you have for us this week?
In light of last week's excellent episode on beefing and the events that took place in the ADOS social media world this week, let's revisit infighting. I'm back on the fence on whether it's good or helpful. I get that infighting naturally occurs, as you explained in the last episode, but publicly, how is it helpful?
It's very justifiable to be concerned about the public perception about the infighting. It can be something that turns people off. At the same time, what happens internally are the people themselves either becoming discouraged or becoming rabble-rousers just for the sake of conflict? Or are they learning from the conflict, establishing standards, and therefore helping leadership do what it needs to do? That too can be reflected and will be observed by the public. How well do they survive such skirmishes or disagreements? So that's what's important. This is the reason why not just complaining, which is a point of emotional stuntedness and traumatized behavior responses, we also should act to establish standards as to how leadership should be either supported or directed to achieve the ultimate goal of the organization.
Well, first, I don't want it to seem like the question is, oh, you're making us look bad in front of white folk. That's not what I'm,
Sadly, that's a factor, but go ahead.
For me, it's we have more than white people detractors from ADOS. So we got Pan-Africans, we got just Democrats that just hate ADOS. We got a lot of people that just hate on ADOS. So they see that as that conflict that we're working out publicly. They see that as something positive in the sense that, okay, well, this is an organization that's in trouble. This is an organization that, not necessarily an organization, but this is a group that's having issues and really would like to see ADOS destroyed in a sense. So
literally.
Organizations fall apart. It can happen. There's nothing that's cemented in ADOS that says that it cannot also happen to us. So when it's happening publicly, Dr. Shauna kind of alluded to this in her video that we heard last week, and that when it's done out in public like that, an enemy, whether whoever looks like, whatever that enemy looks like, or whoever that enemy is, sees the conflict and sees the struggle in that organization and can at the same time exacerbate those issues. Kind of like what COINTELPRO did with the Black Panther. So it's not uncommon that our organizations are not co-opted, and it starts with a lot of times infighting.
Detractors are going to detract. That's their job. The issue is the standards that are set and moral character of those involved to outlast it or be succumbed by it. Martin Luther King, internal infighting because of his stance against the Vietnam War. Was he right? Was he wrong? From your argument and from your stance, he was wrong because
in what
he supported a direction that a lot of his members did not want to go. They wanted to treat America's foreign policy as something separate from domestic policy, although Martin Luther King effectively made it a part of domestic policy because young black men and young white men were being who were poor disproportionately, were being drafted into that military excursion abroad and therefore affecting American domestic policy in terms of what social services could be done for the people.
So so my thing with the Vietnam conflict that he had, was it public?
Yes, it was very public.
I'm not privy to that information.
He was lambasted for doing that, both internal to the group and external to the group. He used to be the top dog in terms of news coverage and positive news coverage. But when he took that turn, he lost a lot of support externally, the public. He also lost a lot of support internal to the group because he took that stance. I ask again, was he right or was he wrong? Well, we know that he was right. And we know that it's very hard sometimes for leadership to do what's right. That's why standards have to be placed, because standards were not placed. Dr. King did not get the support he needed. And not only was that used against him, as you pointed out earlier, it was also used as a means for his assassination that we know this government participated in. So he did the right thing, and the group failed to live up and establish a standard. Instead, they just got scared and sat back and watched the brother get taken out. And that's me being very harsh, but that's in a nutshell what happened. If we had set the standard based on his argument and saying, was it justified for his argument? Well, yes, it was. Then we should have supported him, not leaving him at airports without picking him up, which they did out of Dayton, Ohio. I know a story personally where that happened. And other things that people within the movement turned their backs on him when he needed us most, because they failed to live up to a standard. Instead, he was blamed for causing dissension when his stance was the correct one.
Well, I understand that.
I give all kinds of examples like this.
No, I understand that setting the standard. That's just a position that he was, as a leader, he was going in that the group didn't agree with. But my thing is I wasn't aware that they were fighting publicly about it. But my thing is, evidently, that's an example of public infighting and what can occur.
Exactly. But that means the people internal need to set a standard and then support it. It's all right initially when we have the disagreement, but eventually at some point, a standard needs to be established and people need to agree to that standard and then do that. And then the public sees the dissension at first, but then they see them coalescing upon an agreed upon approach to solving that problem and moving forward. So the longer, and I've shared this with you privately, the longer that we don't do this because we've hit the national stage, then we add to our demise. So it needs to happen. Number one, it's going to happen. It's unavoidable. But standards need to be established so that the group has a mandate to live up to, because so much is at stake, and I shared that last time, as we move forward. That way, the public does see the dissension, but they also see us figuring it out and taking a direction. The longer that we don't do that, the more problems not the public is going to have, but the movement itself has. And that becomes our fault. No need for external people coming in and doing anything at that rate. At the same time, because it's creating all these brush fires around by other people advocating, like in California and even on the continent, advocating for their rights, they're going to do things to either co-opt it or destroy it. And right now, from what I'm gathering, they're doing things to co-opt it, namely this thing that happened in Atlanta with the Pan-Africanists. So detractors are going to detract. They're going to do what they're going to do. Even if we were doing things perfectly and there was no dissension, they would find reasons for dissension, like they did initially when they claimed that we were Russian bots. There was no dissension going on when the detractors did that. Detractors are going to do what detractors are going to do. They're supposed to do that. Our goal is to adapt effectively.
Okay. Well, I don't know.
It's
Maybe
okay.
I got one foot on the fence and one foot on the side of, all right, fight if you will. But I think it's on a case-by-case basis whether or not it's helpful or not.
I don't disagree with that.
So we'll see if this latest brouhaha, is that what you call it? A brouhaha.
That's a good brouhaha, yeah.
If this latest brouhaha shakes up things, shakes the tables enough where, we got to build another one.
Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every fourth Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. You can also get more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda. Please visit ados101.com. In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have
Brookings Fellow predicts reparations could happen in next 10 years. From the publication Axios.com, author and writer Dion Rabouin. Thanks to growing momentum and changing attitudes among Americans, Brookings Institution fellow Andre Perry predicts that within 10 years, the U.S. will provide some form of reparations to Black people. What we're hearing and what's happening in the streets today is indicative of the attitude change that is occurring in America. Perry, a scholar in residence at American University and author, said during an interview from Axios on HBO. When I look out there, it's a much more diverse coalition than I've ever seen before. And so I'm encouraged that reparations is going to happen. Why it matters to the market? Recent economic analyses by McKinsey and Company and Citigroup have both estimated that the racial wealth gap has cost the U.S. economy trillions of dollars and will continue to hold back economic growth until it is closed. I graded this article okay. Up next.
from the publication The Intercept, entitled Unredacted FBI Document Sheds New Light on White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement. Tagline: A 2006 intelligence assessment reveals that officials had concerns about the infiltration of police departments for years, but failed to warn the public. Writer Alice Speary. The FBI has long been concerned about the infiltration of law enforcement by white supremacist groups and its impact on police abuse and tolerance of racism. The unredacted version of a previously circulated document reveals. The FBI Threat Assessment Report was released by Representative Jamie Raskin, chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, ahead of a hearing about the white supremacist infiltration of local police departments scheduled for Tuesday. The redacted sections also include two examples of what the FBI refers to as white supremacist sympathizers. In one, the memo mentions that in July 2006, a former police officer with possible ties to the KKK was charged with civil rights violations involving alleged death threats made against black school children and a black city council member. The public deserves to see the truth reflected in this finally unredacted report, Raskin said in a statement to The Intercept. The FBI saw long ago the multiple potential dangers associated with violent white supremacy and its efforts to infiltrate local law enforcement with ideas, attitudes, and personnel. The FBI was invited but declined to participate in today's hearing. A spokesperson for the committee said, "These newly revealed passages underscore the seriousness of the threat posed by white supremacists to law enforcement personnel and the public at large. The FBI has continued to withhold this full document despite enormous public pressure at a time when the white supremacist threat is rampant again. It's indefensible." I graded this report excellent. And next,
Opinion. It's time for wealthy donors to embrace reparations, not more charity. From the publication MarketWatch.com, author and writer Edgar Villanueva and Chuck Collins. As the coronavirus rages and the economic fallout continues, the wealth gap between our country's largely white top 1% and the black and brown communities bearing the brunt of the pandemic has never been more exposed. U.S. billionaires have increased their wealth by nearly $1 trillion during the pandemic, These billionaires now own 3/4 as much as all black wealth in this country combined, and more than all 59 million US Latinos combined. In the absence of real wealth distribution, the wealthiest Americans have often used philanthropic giving to bandage the wound of this deep inequality. But philanthropy is by and large failing to meet the transformative demands of the era. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's giving pledge is emblematic. A decade ago, when they announced that they would give away at least half their wealth to charity and urged other billionaires to join them, many considered it revolutionary. In the time since, we've seen that grand promises like these are simply not enough. I graded this article excellent. Up next,
from the publication Democracy Now!, entitled A Police Cover-Up? New body cam video from night of Breonna Taylor's killing undermines state account. Tagline, we speak with Vice News correspondent Roberto Ferdman about new body camera coverage he obtained from the police raid that killed Breonna Taylor in Louisville in March, which has raised troubling questions about the integrity of the crime scene and the investigation that followed. Writer Amy Goodman. On Thursday, a grand jury failed to charge any of the 3 white Louisville police officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor with her death. Kentucky's governor, Louisville's mayor have joined calls to release the grand jury transcripts. Video footage also shows Detective Hankinson lingers in Taylor's apartment, even after he's told to leave the scene of the active investigation of an officer-involved shooting, in which he is one of the officers. It also shows that none of the officers who were part of the raid got separated or paired with an escort. This comes as a ballistics report from the Kentucky State Police was unable to determine that Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, shot Officer Jonathan Mattingly, as he has been claimed to have done by the Kentucky Attorney General, or if Mattingly was hit by friendly fire. During the raid, Walker fired a warning shot at the front door and said he believed it was a home invasion. He didn't know who was raiding his apartment. He even called the police to ask for help. He has a license to carry firearms. Meanwhile, the footage from the body cameras appears to corroborate several parts of Walker's testimony. Walker says when officers arrested him, they threatened to set a dog on him and told him he'd spend the rest of his life in jail. I graded this story excellent. And next,
some black Americans buying guns. I'd rather go to trial than go to the cemetery. From the publication KUOW.org, author and writer Christina Silva. Bruce Tomlin, a 63-year-old truck driver from New Mexico, said he was never really a gun person. Then he saw a video of 3 white men following and fatally shooting Ahmaud Arbery while he was jogging. The man is trying to get away and they're just gunning him down in the street like he was a dog, Tomlin said about watching the video of Arbery. It's made me hypervigilant. It has made me nervous. I'll even admit to being a little bit scared sometimes. So he bought a gun and he's planning on buying more. I just feel like, in my viewpoint, every black person in America, especially black males, needs to have some type of protection with them as often as they can. Because I think the political climate is getting to the point where it's just going to be a lot of violence coming our way, Tomlin said. I just feel safer now having a gun, and I didn't always feel that way. I've never been the world's biggest fan of guns, but I just don't feel safe without one. The highest overall firearm sales increase comes from black men and women, who show a 58.2% increase in purchases during the first 6 months of 2020 versus the same period last year. I graded this article good and would advise anyone to practice their Second Amendment right during this time of conflict. And up next,
from the publication Kentucky State AFL-CIO, entitled New Interview Shows Cameron Lied 5 Times About Breonna Taylor Grand Jury Decision. Written by Kenny Colston. In an interview with Louisville TV station WDRB, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron is now admitting that his office never presented any charges against 2 of the officers involved in Breonna Taylor's death, after initially telling reporters 5 times last week that the grand jury had made such decisions themselves. In his press conference announcing the decision last week, Cameron told reporters at least 5 times that the grand jury made the decision to not indict the other officers in the case, Jonathan Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove, when in fact he never presented such an option to the grand jury. I graded this report good. This article came on right out and said that the AG Cameron lied. The key element that made this possible was that this report came from the Democratic Party in Kentucky. Such a perspective is biased from the standpoint of party politics, yet it was not inaccurate in identifying what the AG did in this case. When seeking truth in such an important matter as a human life, such clarity is not only needed, it is required. Next rapid news, let's see what CNN does with this same case. And next,
one of America's first slave owners was black. Do his descendants get reparations? From the publication The Daily Observer, author and writer Michael Knowles. House Democrats want taxpayers to fund reparations for the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of black slaves. Former Democratic presidential candidate Cory Booker appeared as a witness during the first panel of a Juneteenth hearing on the proposal. No country in history has ever paid reparations to descendants of African slaves for their ancestors' servitude. Less than 4% of Africans sold in the Atlantic slave trade ended up in the present-day United States. Democrats pressing for reparations have yet to answer the central question: how would it work? History raises more questions than answers. On March 8th of either 1654 or 1655, the African indentured servant John Kacer became the first person arbitrarily declared a slave for life in America. Kacer claimed to have already served his indenture of 7 or 8 years. Nevertheless, a Virginia court ruled in favor of Kacer's master, a black Angolian named Anthony Johnson. I graded this article a fail. The author doesn't know enough to be talking about reparations. He has many questions that can't seem to be figured out. What about this? What about that? How will we and why will we? And who's going to pay? And I don't want to. All of this is boiling down to just mere complaints, which the stereotype is black people complain a lot. Well, I'm here to tell you, fellow Americans, you complaining about our legitimate complaints makes you just as much a complainer. Welcome to the club. And up next,
from the publication CNN, entitled "Officer Testified That Police Knocked 6 or 7 Times Before Breonna Taylor Was Fatally Shot." Tagline: listeners, this will be an article analysis. Authors of this article, Ray Sanchez, Elizabeth Joseph, and Nicole Chavez, are being evaluated. Stats: just as context is important, more of the nitty-gritty lies within perspective and content. First, whose point of views are being emphasized or given weight in this article? Variable instances of perspectives in this article are: police verbally announced themselves, mentioned 3 times. Police warned the victims of their presence by knocking 3 times. AG Cameron explains his actions and intentions 5 times. Governor is quoted once. Officers' attorneys 3 times. Victims' attorneys 2 times. And the writers themselves 2 times. Totaling CNN offering its readers official perspectives a total of 13 times in this article. Advocates for the victims 3 times. Next, how is the content weighed? Paid agents of the state went through the trouble of obtaining a no-knock warrant. All nearby residents reported that police did not announce themselves. There was one who said they did, but this witness recounted this statement later. There is evidence that this witness was badgered. CNN mentioned none of this. Paid agents of the state were to monitor the target house prior to invading. They were unaware of Breonna Taylor's boyfriend's presence. They further claimed that they were unwilling to abide by their own request for a no-knock warrant because they realized that there were children in the home which they wanted to give Miss Taylor a chance to warn prior to invading. Later in the article, another officer indicates they believe Miss Taylor was alone. Isn't the purpose of the no-knock warrant to surprise the target so that they cannot destroy or discard evidence? CNN never explains or questions why law enforcement were willing to destroy their case for the sake of the children, which sounds nice, doesn't it? Then in that case, why enter the home at all? CNN never explains the discrepancy of children in the home and Miss Taylor's being alone. CNN also doesn't mention the fact that the invading team did not have body cameras on, though several members of the team were issued such equipment prior to this raid. CNN mentions the FBI ballistics report, which confirms the bullet responsible for Miss Taylor's death, but fails to mention the ballistics test, which was inconclusive regarding the bullet that hit the officer. CNN also fails to mention the officers responsible for the 5 bullets which hit Miss Taylor. Absolutely no mention of this by CNN. I graded this article poor. CNN paraphrases A.G. Cameron, stating the grand jury could have considered other charges against the officers on its own. CNN never informs the reader that it's the AG's job to present all relevant evidence to the case for the grand jurors to consider. In this case, CNN permits the juror's attorney to allude to the fact that this wasn't done. The Kentucky State AFL-CIO story mentioned earlier covers the state and calls A.G. Cameron an outright liar, while CNN presents news for the nation and obscures A.G. Cameron's actions, while at the end of the article pointing out and highlighting how A.G. Cameron is the first black person to hold the post and is a rising Republican star. There are many other areas of content in this article which add up to the fact this was a CNN institutional racist violence puff piece, performed in order to obfuscate officers, A.G. Cameron, and other officials of the murder of an ADOS citizen. This article is not worth your time. And next,
California to study reparations for Black Americans. From the publication KPX Channel 5, authors and writers, KPIX staff. California will develop a detailed plan for reparations under a new law signed on Wednesday by Governor Gavin Newsom, making it the first state to mandate a study of how it can make amends for its role in oppression of Black people. The law creates a 9-member task force to come up with the proposals for how the state could provide reparations to Black Americans, what form these reparations may take, and who would be eligible to receive them. This is not just about California, this is about making an impact and a dent across the rest of the country, Newsom said moments after signing the bill during a ceremony broadcast on his YouTube channel. The law does not limit reparations to slavery, although it requires the task force to give special consideration for Black people who are descendants of slaves. The law does not say the reparation must be cash payments. Other options could include forgiving student loans and paying for public works projects or job training. I graded this article good. We want to give a shout out to ADOS LA and all the other California chapters for their hard work in getting this legislation passed. And up next,
from the publication Greg Palast Investigative Journalism, entitled Cancel Culture, the Scourge of the Voter Purge. Tagline: hundreds of thousands of voters have been struck from the voter rolls and they have no idea. Writer Greg Palast. There's no question that this attack on the voter rolls is affecting voters of color and young people. Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanic voters are being removed by the hundreds of thousands from the voter rolls of America. And this could absolutely change the outcome of the election. Our problem is that our investigation found in just Georgia alone that nearly 200,000 voters were wrongly tagged as having moved from their home, dying, or being imprisoned. Their only crime, frankly, is voting while Black. I'm not for voter fraud, people voting twice or dead people voting, but that doesn't happen. I actually calculated from the official U.S. statistics that the chance of your getting hit and killed by a lightning strike is 500% more likely than that you will commit voter fraud. Americans don't cast fraudulent ballots because you go to jail for 5 years. The purge of the voter rolls has been conducted mostly by voting officials who are Republicans. Because if you remove voters of color and young people, you're going to remove Democratic votes. Now, Democrats play these games too, but in general elections, it's the Republicans who are removing and blocking the votes of hundreds of thousands of voters of color and young people in several states: Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, and other states. I graded this report excellent. As Mr. Palast indicated, Democrats work to suppress Black votes as well, yet they do so on local, state, and national primaries. Therefore, Republicans, Democrats, the Supreme Court, and the news media work together to suppress the Black vote. The news media specifically fails to report on how both parties engage in this institutional racist violence, thus making it seem as though it is solely the act of the bad cop Republicans. It is this and other reasons why we must operatively realize that white political elites are unified. Acting as though they operate solely on political right or left interest is not only inaccurate, it is perilously foolhardy, especially if you are ADOS. And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted in our Facebook group and in the show notes on our website. Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of ADOS podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life.
In the book that I've just completed with Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, we argue that the payments might be made in the form of endowments or a trust account, where individuals would be allowed to spend the interest off the account in any given year, but could only dip into the principal subject to approval for a plan of action or a proposal that they develop. In the present moment, the federal government overnight essentially came up with, well, some people say it's $2.2 trillion. Some people say it's as much as $6 trillion because of the loans that were made by the Federal Reserve Board. But it came up with that money overnight. There were no new taxes administered. And I think that the present experience, or the current experience, demonstrates that the federal government can spend on virtually anything it wants to spend on. You're denying all newly emancipated Black Americans, virtually all of them, you're denying them any initial stake in wealth as compensation for their years of forced labor and forced time under slavery. That's how you begin to create, that's the origin point, I think, for the contemporary racial wealth gap. That's where it started.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will interview the article, How White and Non-Black People Can Pay Reparations Even If Congress Never Figures It Out. From the publication BusinessInsider.com, author and writer Tiffany Lachey Curtis. I will ask the questions and Daud will give the answers. Before we begin, I've noticed a pattern with current articles on race and reparations. It always starts with
George Floyd and
Breonna Taylor, right? Exactly. It's a broken record at this point, and it doesn't speak to the decades of which Black Americans have been fighting for reparations, not just recently and not just because of George and Breonna. May they rest in peace.
But the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and countless other Black individuals at the hands of police have reignited the Black Lives Matter movement, and with it, a renewed interest in reparations for Black Americans in the United States.
Speak to the historical ways in which the topic of reparations has been addressed.
Reparations for Black Americans have been a debated topic for well over a century, and they have often been deemed unnecessary or too radical a concept. While politicians create task forces and bills to study reparations, Black and brown community organizers and activists are working at the local level to turn reparations from an idea into real assistance right now for the Black community and its most vulnerable members.
Yes, and many have made significant progress. California has set a precedent for the new bill that was passed recently. It was a long road to get there. I'm optimistic about what a bill like that can do. It's been overdue. Since the days of the freed slaves, someone has been fighting.
And then there was the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule.
Before you start, there are so many examples, but this seems to be the go-to reparations failure that everyone uses. Continue.
Many Black Americans are familiar with the phrase 40 acres and a mule and its promise of Black livelihood. In 1865, the U.S. government, as part of Special Field Order Number 15, promised 40 acres of land and later a mule to formerly enslaved Black people. However, the order was overturned by President Andrew Johnson in the fall of 1865, and the 400,000 acres of land meant to be redistributed were returned to their white Southern owners, extinguishing the hope that future generations of Black Americans might know generational wealth and prosperity.
Is there a connection between 40 acres and a mule and Breonna Taylor?
I only brought it up as the effects of this broken promise are still felt today. As the racial wealth gap continues to widen at an alarming rate, the Brookings Institution reports that the average white family enjoys a net worth that is almost 10 times more than the average black family, while research conducted by author and scholar Chuck Collins estimates that the median wealth of a white household is closer to 41 times more than that of a black household.
We call that the racial wealth gap, which most people are aware of. But the solutions don't seem to be an effective remedy towards fixing the racial wealth gap.
You're correct. And we are even more aware that it's even worse for the most marginalized individuals within the black community, including LGBTQ or disabled individuals, experience even less financial security and access to resources. This is why reparations matter. And while we might never see reparations from the federal government, mutual aid efforts and direct giving by white and non-black people may be the closest we'll ever get.
I don't believe you can provide numbers like you did and then say, but the federal government may never give reparations. The federal government is complicit defendants in the case and are guilty as charged. I don't feel we should ignore and excuse their involvement.
Well, hear me out. Interpersonal reparations can begin to redistribute wealth. Recently, we've seen the emergence online of reparations groups, mutual aid funds, and even social media threads where black people can drop their payment handles and receive funds or non-cash assistance, like rides to work or groceries.
But that is piecemeal and charitable contributions at best and does nothing to close the gap on a massive level. No, getting a black person some coffee is not reparations. It's kind, but not reparations.
These efforts seek to redistribute wealth or resources directly from white and non-black people and come at a time when black people navigate COVID-19 related losses and racial trauma. According to Jingle H, a community organizer and member of Housing Reparations Philly, this kind of person-to-person giving can go a long way towards wealth distribution. Jingle, who uses they/them pronouns, requested that we use their last initial only due to the sensitive nature of their work.
Honestly, Jingle from Philly does not know enough about what an effective reparations program is, and it will never be person to person. It is only a massive government program.
They also state black, queer, and trans marginalized genders, femmes, sex workers, darker skinned, fatter, hood, poor, different abled, and other folks with less proximity to whiteness are affected by the harms of oppression at a higher and deeper capacity, says Jingle. Whites and non-black people can start by listening to these groups, then construct and execute plans to turn over all wealth and resources that have been gained by way of systemic oppression.
We need for those same people to fight for legislature locally and nationally that will redistribute that stolen wealth, not selecting random black people and organizations, but our whole group in a massive swoop.
But ways for white and non-black people to commit to reparations in the long term, while support for the Black Lives Matter movement surged after the murder of George Floyd, that support has dwindled in recent months, according to a report by the Pew Research Center.
So we're out of the reparations news cycle?
Yes, there were countless social media posts on how to be an ally to black people, and white and non-black public figures and everyday people declared their solidarity, giving to mutual aid funds and social justice organizations. Now, though, that momentum has come to a halt. State-sanctioned violence against black lives and systemic racism have persisted for centuries, and performative allyship or brief support for the black community cannot heal centuries of harm. Support must continue for real change to occur.
And what are these reparations being called?
Interpersonal reparations. It can take many forms, says Jingle. Some examples include covering health care, transportation, and education costs, helping black people secure housing by being a co-signer, paying their rent, mortgage, buying land for black folks, moving out of historically black neighborhoods, and helping black people pay down their debt.
This is absolutely charity, but because the fight for a real reparation plan will be hard and take work and time, we should settle. Some may, but most don't need their rent paid. We need it to be affordable and not predatory.
White and non-black people who aren't in a financial position to do any of the above can consider other ways to use their privilege or resources.
Why would we put the burden of reparations on individual Americans when the government, who again is complicit, can actually implement $1 trillion program, which they just did recently a few months ago?
Jingle suggests that white and non-black people use their power to uplift and center black and indigenous people by sharing their skills, access to resources, and their platforms. In practice, this can look like highlighting black business owners or creators of social media, recommending a black person for a work opportunity, speaking out about discriminatory policies in your workplace, creating free or sliding scale offerings for black people, helping slow the spread of gentrification by not moving into predominantly black neighborhoods. It's also important that white and non-black people acknowledge their privilege and discuss anti-black racism with each other, rather than expecting black people to perform free labor in order to educate them on it. Be intentional and consistent in your commitment to reparations and create a real plan that will allow you to give your time, money, or access to help support black lives.
Many of those things that you mentioned seem like special treatment. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a debt that is owed to be paid so that we can repair ourselves from the years of discrimination and terrorism. Aren't most of those things that you listed something that our society should be doing anyway? Reparations is separate and apart from those community responsibilities. It's a direct redress, like I said, for a specific wrong.
Nevertheless, I agree with Jingle and also have an idea of what reparations can look like in the future.
Does it involve cutting checks and a black agenda?
Well, it would be up to reparations groups and mutual aid organizations who are imagining a future in which black and indigenous people have access to safe and secure housing, quality education, nourishing food, and other resources that have been readily available to white people for so long.
That's a no. Again, those are things a community should already be doing. Yes, they are not doing it, but it's a separate issue. I don't think reparations is a pie in the sky demand. We have provided it to other groups, so it's something the U.S. is very capable of doing. It's only so far neutralizing a group or segregating us and neglecting can go before we turn up.
Back in 1865, the 40 acres and a mule proposal was radical for its time, and though it was included in a decree written by a white man, it was an idea born out of talks with black community leaders. Today, black community leaders are continuing the legacy of dreaming up and articulating what a future with black equity looks like, a future that includes reparations.
We cannot continue to dream. We are literally headed for a disaster as a community. Social programs, charity, and welfare were ineffective. In fact, more white people benefited from those programs, including affirmative action. So ADOS has stopped dreaming and wishing and are demanding a full reparations program specifically for American descendants of slavery from our government. Our government who instituted chattel slavery, who turned a blind eye to domestic terrorism, who legalized Jim Crow laws and discrimination. Our government who allowed economic apartheid and redlining. Our government who to this day continues to impose a quiet, soft genocide on the ADOS community. So no, they will never be off the hook. And until the debt is owed, is paid, we will still fight.
But until that day comes, if it comes at all, community care and a real willingness from white and non-black people of color to give to reparations efforts, to support and defend all black people, to center the most marginalized among us, and to give up their power might be the path to giving black people what has long been owed.
I need you, Jingle, white and non-black people of color, to go to ADOS101.com, familiarize yourself with what a reparations and a black agenda plan looks like, read Solidarity and A. Christian Mullen's book From Here to Equality, and other foremost economists on how to approach this topic, because a cup of coffee or a full tank of gas is just a bad idea. Being nice to your neighbors is not a reparations plan. Well, that completes this interview. Listeners, you can get the link to this full article on our website in this week's show notes. Coming up, we have the commentary on this article. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned. We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articles of ADOS. All right, what we think of this article?
It was a bit confusing for me. There was someone speaking for this Mr. Jingle person, and this Mr. Jingle was heading an effort to basically reshape or rename reparations in the form of basically neighbors being kind to their neighbors. That's kind of what I got out of it.
That is it in a nutshell.
Okay.
It's a bad reparation idea. He calls it interpersonal reparations because they see that fighting for reparations with the federal government is an uphill battle. More pessimistic in the sense that they don't say it or mention it, but I think they think that it can never get done. Yeah. Well, ADOS doesn't think that way. And several people, including a Brookings fellow earlier in the Rapid News Report, feels it can happen in the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. Yes, we're out of the news cycle as far as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And yes, maybe those contributions have dwindled towards Black Lives Matter, but
wave has come back.
Yeah, just wait. Just wait. We're in America, and because of the lack of accountability that America gives to our counterparts and our fellow Americans, just wait. There will be another, unfortunately, Breonna Taylor. There will be another, unfortunately, George Floyd, until we address the real issue of racial wealth, inequality, and injustice in America. So the ideas, what do you think about some of the ideas of, pay our rent, pay down our debt, give to organizations, much of what they're doing now.
Yeah.
Much of what they're doing now, everybody's picking and choosing who they're going to give money to. Maybe you put a little dollar in a cup of a African-American homeless guy on the street. You gave him reparations, right? That was reparations. You gave him some help. That doesn't speak to the masses.
Yeah, that's right.
It's piecemeal, it's charity, and it doesn't close the racial wealth gap.
Which is the whole point. Well, you see, I'll hit two things going on here, and I'll also be brief. One is our past discussion in our previous episode. Is this beef? This could be considered beef. He could be representative of other groups. He sounds like he may be involved in a grassroots group. Are we just down on the brother for just trying to contribute or trying to help? Or are we setting a standard of expectations that needs to be met in order to achieve the goal that will help the collective? You see, this is not a hard argument for me, but for some reason, people just get lost in the idea that I'm criticizing the brother. I'm not just criticizing the brother. I'm providing evidence-based analysis and data to justify my stance, not against him, but to help straighten him out so he can get on board and help us out with his effort, or he can continue to be lost like he is. And that's his choice. But for now, we've got to create a standard of excellence that helps us to achieve the goal for the collective. And this obviously doesn't do it. And confronting the brother about that is not downing the brother. It's attempting to set him straight so that we can help out the collective, mainly the children whose futures are bleak. The other aspect of this also is the identity of or the awareness of how the society works as a whole, as you really did a great job of pointing out. It'd be really nice if allies to our cause does what this guy is advocating. I think that's a good idea, that they be more consciously aware of how they could be of help on a regular, everyday basis. But we cannot then label that reparations, because that's not reparations. The issue is one of debt to the collective that needs to be paid and that is owed to the collective, not individual acts of kindness, which would be nice if they would take place on a larger scale, but they apparently are not, and they can't be easily measured to determine if it's really making the collective whole. What we do know, which will make the collective whole, is if there's radical systematic changes in both not just money and cutting a check, but also restructuring the society so that there's levels of ownership that were also stolen from us that we're able to engage in and an effect in our lives.
This to me is textbook letting our government off the hook. Mm-hmm. You're completely, I don't know, putting the government in a corner somewhere and saying, we're not going to deal with you. Our next door neighbor is the one that's going to give us the reparations. Our local churches and faith-based organizations and philanthropists are the ones that are going to change Black Americans. Has that worked? Has that worked?
And what I said last time, we're in a stage period where we don't have that much time because of the context of upward mobility. It's been reported for the past 2 years, even before COVID, that there's very little upward mobility of all American citizens. So we've got more American citizens, even white American citizens, that are not having the mobility that they once had prior to 2008.
Yeah, you're not moving from working lower class, exactly, up into middle class, upper class.
So now this person is expecting them to ultimately pick up that burden when they're in a state. This is another reason why these white supremacist groups are out and about trying to prevent another civil rights gains. And that's a lot of what they're trying to do, because they see their position as lesser than because of white elite thievery. They just won't confront the white elite thievery. What they will say is to lower caste groups, your life will not get better while our lives are struggling. So within this context, he's expecting them to do more when they've got less than their parents had, which has already been documented. It's crazy on itself. But for him, to himself and his group members, it sounds like a great idea from that perspective. But it, on a larger measure, it needs to be criticized. Therefore, again, I have to make this argument again. We're not downing the brother. We've got to straighten the brother out because he's getting in our way.
In a recent video that you showed me about the gentleman that's doing the protest for the Amazon workers, even he kind of hinted to that, well, maybe Jeff Bezos, is it Bezos?
Doesn't matter. He's weird.
Even Amazon Bezos can pitch in a little bit more and do more with his, millions and trillions and billions of dollars. Well, that takes government policy because, first of all, that I don't want to take us in a different direction and off topic, but that's wealth calcification that takes government legislation, and it takes like fair business practices laws and things, because he is clearly monopolizing. Okay.
Yeah.
So there shouldn't be Jeff Bezos. Is what I'm trying to is what I'm trying to say. There should be laws in place to prevent him so that the wealth can be evenly distributed amongst the people, so that we won't have to rely on him to give us piecemeal charity.
And it's a shame that we're repeating history again, the Gilded Age, and a lot of the calls for them to basically transfer some of their wealth to help out the lower echelon people. I guess that worked to some degree in its time until people got tired of white people got tired of sending their wives out to basically prostitute themselves to put food on the table. They got so upset with that they started demanding a better workplace, a better income, and better safety in the workplace. Again, we're just redoing this. They've dwindled us down to part-time work and catching a hustle, trying to make it appealing to be in this sphere.
I think they call it gig economy, right?
Yeah, the gig economy. They've given these names, and they've atomized us into these age groups now to make us more manageable, that we should just care about our millennial group, or we should just care about, all these were attempts to get us not to think collectively and to realize that our collective group are lower caste or class and in a struggle against people who are elite. How do you tell these groups that are suffering under these things that are reducing social mobility and expect them as individuals to provide for the debt that is owed, that was installed by a government they also live in? It doesn't make any sense.
Nope, it doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous to ask for fellow Americans to individually do reparation initiative. Please, organizations, anyone that wants to be nice to your neighbors, fellow Americans, we're not suggesting you don't do that. That's just something out of your kindness of your heart. But reparations will come from the federal government. Our government is the one that owes this redress, and they're the ones that will pay it. And that's it for today's commentary on this week's main event. As always, the link to the article we interviewed will be in the show notes on our website, articlesofADOS.com. ADOS Showcase, where we get to share ADOS-related talents and gifts. This week, we present the Reparations song by Ernest Cooper.
This song is dedicated to all the African Americans, descendants of slaves. This country was built on the backs of the African American slaves. So here is our reparations song.
African American descendants of slaves.
Come on now.
Give the reparations to descendants of slaves.
Still feel the pain.
Still feel the pain, and we suffer every day. Descendants of slaves in the
We don't find it hard to make this request of orphan land struggle, so do your best to include descendants economically, build up the wealth gap in the industry. Before the Civil War, African slaves were tortured and abused, violated to the graves. Plantation slaves were the ones most punished, slaved in the fields and they got no money.
African American descendants of slaves.
Come on now.
Give the reparations to descendants of slaves.
Still feel the pain.
Still feel the pain, and we suffer every day. Descendants of slaves in the USA.
After Civil War, slaves were freed, then on Confederates fought in the U.S. One that took the chains off of bodies and placed it on the mind. Jim Crow made it hard for me to get mine. Free health care, baby bonds, you see. Stop racism in the place to be. Right the wrong, clear your conscience at last, and stop the abuse of the haunted past.
African American descendants of slaves.
Come on now.
Give the reparations to descendants of slaves.
Still feel the pain.
Still feel the pain, and we suffer every day. Descendants of slaves in the USA.
From this day on, we got to keep it in check. Descendants of slaves get more respect. Now that you know just who we are, we got to stop hate crime, cause it went too far. Equal rights, education for free. Take the chains off our minds and let us go free. Free to live without discrimination. To give the people the credit where the credit is due.
African American descendants of slaves.
Come on now.
Give the reparations to descendants of slaves.
Feel the pain.
Still feel the pain, and we suffer every day. Descendants of slaves in the USA. African American descendants of slaves.
Come on now.
Give the reparations to descendants of slaves.
And that was Ernest Cooper. You can find him on YouTube, and all artist information will be featured in our show notes on our webpage, articlesofADOS.com. If you too would like to submit your art, send us a clean version to art@articlesofADOS.com.
We're coming to get our check.
There you have it, another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofADOS.com, where you can join our mailing list and see the show notes for today's episode.
Be sure to tune in next Friday for a new episode of Undiscussed News you may have missed. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
And remember, you can catch us live at 10 a.m. every Friday on WCRS 92.7 and 98.3 here in Columbus, Ohio. Also head over to our Patreon page to support the podcast as we give you weekly news and information important to our community. Until next time, family, stay safe and stay strong. Peace.
We're coming to get our check. We're coming to get our check. We're coming to get our check.